Good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon. Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Michael Miner, and I am the National Director of the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated Hope Health Ministry. We welcome you today to today's webinar, the 1619 Project Critical Race Theory, a Conversation. We acknowledge our president of our National Baptist Convention, USA Incorporated, Dr. Jerry Young, our General Secretary, Dr. Alvin Edwards, the chair of our Federal Faith-Based Initiatives, Dr. Alvin Love. And this week, we are participating in our National Baptist Congress, and we acknowledge the president of our Congress, Dr. Elliott Cuff, and the dean, Dr. Carl Washington. And of course, we salute all of the staff members of our Hope Health Ministry team and our health ambassadors all across the country. Welcome, welcome, welcome. As before, we are restreaming on social media. We hope today, because of the conversation that we're having, and it is not only critical race theory, but this is a critical webinar. We hope that you would share it on your Facebook page and tag some people. Share out the link. We look forward to a great conversation. And we hope that you will be blessed by it and that you will share it in the Christian education aspects of your congregation. We do want to acknowledge our teacher for the week, Minister Geraldine Moore, and her associates, Pastor Bernard Montgomery, Pastor Dexter Moraney, and Sister Linda Copper. They had a great session this week. In our module 3, every morning from 10 to 12, they had a blessed time. We certainly give kudos for the work they've done. And for those that want to continue on and take some of our courses, you can go to our YouTube page for modules 1 and 2. Be on the lookout for more information about that. All right, about today's webinar. Well, we're gonna have a conversation. We're gonna talk about something that's been literally white hot in the news media, this whole idea about critical race theory. And I want to introduce our special guest today, who's going to come and share. Let me just for a moment here, add her on as a spotlight. All right, well, what can I say about Diane Klein? First of all, we are classmates of, I feel, the greatest class to ever come out of Harvard University, the Harvard class of 1987. I always nicknamed us the compassionate class, that I was always up for debate, but that's okay. That was my tagline. I love what she said in her bio. I know where to start. Just go to DianeJKlein.com. That's DianeJKlein. And Sister Copper can also, I got to share that with you, Sister Copper. She's equity-minded, anti-racist educator, legal scholar, and creator of educational materials. What jumped out at me on you all when she had the word on there about anti-racist. We'll get more to that as we move along. That really just stuck with me. All right. And then she's a law professor and educational consultant. Now let's check this next thing out. She taught law at an HBCU, Thurgood Marshall School of Law, Texas Southern University in Houston, Texas. And she's the one that said, with everything going crazy during the pandemic and private colleges were shutting down, she said that HBCUs need more support than ever before. She, of course, in addition to that wonderful degree from Harvard University, she went on to the UCLA School of Law, where she earned her Juris Doctorate, and she didn't stop there. You know, some people just stop at that and roll with it, but she was at the University of San Francisco School of Law, and she had a master's there, and especially area in taxation. I love her, a part of a website, The Professor in Your Corner. Look, if you have not gone to a website and looked at it, there's a lot of great information there for. So look, we're glad to have our special guest and our national expert here on critical race theory, and my classmate, Harvard class of 1987, Diane Klein. Welcome, Diane. Okay.
There we go. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I'm humbled and honored to have the opportunity to talk with you and with the attendees of the webinar about a subject that I regard as important as any that is facing our country. And that's always been true. The enslavement of Africans and persons of African descent is America's original sin. We've never come to terms with it. We've never reckoned with it in the way that we need to. As a country, we have been in flight from it. And once again, we are presented with an opportunity, I think, to engage with it in a way that holds forth an opportunity for change. Whether we're going to take it, I don't know. And we certainly see the forces of reaction arrayed against it. And we need to educate ourselves and arm ourselves in that way to be able to resist that. So that's what I'm hoping to do a little bit.
All right, y'all. You heard the key word there. All right. Diane said we got to resist it. So, okay, resist. Back in the day, we had the Black Power. Okay, so we got to learn on the resist. Okay, this is what we're going to do. Sister Carper, I just emailed you the run of the show, so you have some other information that you need. And we want to make sure that we put Diane's website there. We're going to go through and have a great dialogue today. If you have questions, feel free to put those in the chat. We're going to do our best also to monitor our social media. We'll try to integrate some as we go. Others, we will go ahead and we will talk about them at a later time. We want to be able to go through this. I do want to say that I don't usually beg too often, but I'm begging you to share this information because there are others out there who are sharing it in the wrong way. Diane, I have so many questions. This thing has come up. It's like when my wife and I went to the holiday gathering for President Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, before he was out of office, and they had a whole room full of food and stuff. Didn't know where to start. It was just like a kid in the candy store. So I don't know how to start with all this. So many things, and we can go so many topics and go with everything. All right, a lot of things to ask you, but let me get started. All right, so we want to start with some definitions. Okay, I think there've been a lot of misconceptions out there, even among people of color, people that are trying or open-minded or middle, whatever you want to say, and don't get it. So let's start with the biggest one of all. Let's walk through this thing, and it's right to the other side of my face here. It's on the right if I'm looking at the camera, and it's this thing called critical race theory. To be honest, I heard of it briefly. I saw it out there, but all of a sudden now it's talking about more than the weather. So what is, Diane, for our people watching, critical race theory? First of all, give me the abridged version and then go and discuss it. Here we go. Listen up, everybody.
The abridged version is that critical race theory is a group of ideas that developed in the late 80s in a handful of American law schools, including primarily Harvard, that was intended to help understand why a generation after the major pieces of civil rights litigation and legislation that we associate with the 1960s, why a generation later, so little had really changed. Why, despite fair housing laws, fair employment laws, the Voting Rights Act, so little in the real material conditions of the lives of most Black people in the United States, so very little had changed. Right? It is an attempt to understand large-scale structures, legal and non-legal, that operate to subordinate and oppress people of color generally, but Black people specifically, the history of anti-Black racism in the United States, and its continuing role, notwithstanding very dramatic and hard-fought legal reforms. Why wasn't law enough? That's what it is intended to answer. And it's not the only possible answer. The particular sorts of answers that critical race theory developed are not the only answers to those questions. People on both the left and the right have other answers to those questions. And whether critical race theory's answers are the ones that one finds the most persuasive depends in part on whether one sees what the critical race theorists see when they look out into the United States, how best to account for the persistence of wealth gaps and income gaps, in health outcome gaps, in continuing racial residential segregation, and continuing educational segregation and underattainment by persons of color, particularly Black people, in rates of incarceration and engagement in the criminal justice system. Again, notwithstanding landmark Supreme Court cases, gigantic pieces of legislation, right? Why was it taking so long for things to change? And the people who first put these theories together were law students, mostly in their 20s, and some of their professors who were impatient for change, right? That is, we look back at the 80s and already it's been now, again, you know, as the class of 87, right? Our reunions keep coming. And we say they were impatient in the 80s because what happened in the 60s hadn't changed the world. But precious little has changed even in the succeeding 40 years in many of these key areas: criminal justice, education, residential segregation, wealth and income gaps. And critical race theory is an attempt to explain the persistence of those things in a way that does not begin from the premise that persons of any race are just inherently worse and less deserving or less able. It rejects any such theory and looks elsewhere to account for the persistence of inequality.
All right, look, I want to make a note here for everybody. So if you, I know a lot of you see it taking notes and doing things for all our webinars. A couple of things that Diane said that jump off the page. This is not something new. It started back in the 80s, the 80s, the 80s, the 80s, the 80s. Okay. All right. So it's been around. Okay. It's been around. All right. The next thing is that it was not designed by, to be a jump off of Marxism. It was a framework to really understand why, with everything we got in place, racism still persisted. I won't name the politician out there and others who are saying it's all about Marxism and everything else, but we see how it does. Related folks, it's just a framework to just talk about and describe why things are still the way they are. But look, I got to throw something else out here. That's why it's on the other side of me. Let's make sure. And I want you to do just, if you do halfway what you did, we talked the other night, you're gonna be batting 1,000 here, Diane, about helping me to understand how the 1619 project fits into this. Because until I talk to Diane, everybody, for our discussion for our district Congress, we're going to talk about the 1619 project. So how does that piece fit into this conversation about critical race theory?
Sure. Well, the 1619 project is a publication in the first instance. It was a special issue of the New York Times Magazine, which is included with that newspaper every Sunday, and it's got everything in there: fashion and culture, politics, etc. But they decided to bring out a special issue in the summer of 2019 to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first enslaved African people in North America. Now, there's some dispute among historians about whether the event commemorated there really is the very first, etc., but we can put that to one side. The argument that is made by Nicole Hannah-Jones, who was the creator of that project, for which she won a Pulitzer, and the authors and artists, photographers, and historians and others that she worked with, is that the history of the United States should be understood as beginning not in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence from the United Kingdom, from England, but rather with the beginning of the distinctively racialized form of democracy that emerged, especially in the mid-Atlantic states, beginning in the 17th century, and that intertwined in a unique way, right, never before seen on Earth, a country that was in some ways dedicated to ideals of freedom and equality and liberty, and at the same time, right, was built upon the bound labor of a racialized class of persons. And that paradox is at the heart of the American project, right? That slavery is not some marginal occurrence, but was entwined in every part of the formation of the country that became the United States. That is, long before it was the United States, some of these structures were being put in place. And part of the argument of the project was that their effects continue to be felt down to the present day. Beyond the Civil War, beyond Reconstruction, beyond the Civil Rights Movement, the effects of some of these foundational ideas continue to be felt all the way to the present day. And that's what the project was designed to do. Since then, there have been additional materials produced, including materials that can be used in classrooms. They've taken their show on the road, right? It exists in many forms. But that's the heart of the project. That is, it's a reassessment of American history in a way that makes the role of slavery, economic, political, psychological, social, and the experiences of enslaved persons central to and not marginal to that account.
All right, so now, okay, so the 1619 project came up because, we're coming to the 400th anniversary and all this stuff. So I'm curious as to why the 1619 project is not the big part of the conversation and instead of critical race theory. Why does it, the people out there that are blowing this up, why just run with the 1619 project and do that instead of critical race theory? Why did critical race theory come to the forefront over the 1619 project?
I would say there are a few reasons.
Okay.
One is that the 1619 project is in some ways narrower, and to engage with it is to engage with the specific historical claims that it makes. Okay. And there certainly are those who believe that in order to defend the legitimacy of the United States, we have to imagine that its founding fathers were saints or some such thing, and geniuses, right? All rolled into one.
Oh my.
But critical race theory takes a much broader look at lots of things that are going on, right? It's not only a historical project, it's not even centrally a historical project. Gotcha. Critical race theory is a way of critiquing and understanding current law and policy, right? So it doesn't just provide us a historical lens where we might disagree, right? Was George Washington a good guy or a bad guy? Was Thomas Jefferson a good guy or a bad guy? Was the American Revolution fought to end slavery, to defend slavery, whatever the case may be? Critical race theory threatens, from some people's point of view, to upend a wide variety of received beliefs about what sort of place the United States is. And so it's much larger in scope. And I think that makes it naturally a bigger target.
All right, gotcha. Y'all got that. All right, hope y'all got that, got that. Look, one thing I've got to say, let me say this before I forget, until I start having a conversation with Diane, I used to love to watch the movies about the Alamo. I thought it was so great and so wonderful. Then I discovered that the Alamo was really the first battle of the Civil War, and that it was all part of Mexico's move to try to get rid of slavery, and they were trying to keep slavery. And I was like, oh my God, I didn't know. And it's more things out there. And I suggest to you to do like I've started to do, is just kind of reassess some of the things I've always held true. But I'm gonna go on because something else jumped out to me that Diane talked about. Would you talk about this whole concept of intersectionality and the critical race theory? Kind of help us define that and how those two things connect.
Sure. And one thing I will say, kind of by way of introduction, both to talking more about critical race theory and to talking about intersectionality specifically, is that I was fortunate enough to have Kimberly Crenshaw, the person who coined the term intersectionality, as a professor of mine at the UCLA Law School. This was already in the, I guess she was a professor of mine in 1996 and 1997, by which time she was already quite academically prominent. But intersectionality and critical race theory, if you had told the law professors and law students that it would soon be on everybody's lips, nobody would have believed it, right? It was, I wouldn't exactly say it was obscure for people who work in that area. It's a very powerful analytical model, but the idea that it would somehow leave the law schools and kind of take over the popular culture would have come as a surprise to everyone involved in it, and certainly Professor Crenshaw not least among them. The idea that she began working on, and she was part of that core group at the Harvard Law School who worked with Professor Derek Bell, who was the first
Oh,
Black tenured faculty member at the Harvard Law School. She was a student of his. So she was part of that core group that were working on trying to understand why civil rights laws and landmark cases had not changed life in America for Black people more and faster. And that fused for her with other work that she was doing as a legal feminist. And the idea that she began working on was a way of articulating how different categories to which a person might be thought of as belonging, some of which are favored and others of which are disfavored by law or socially, interact instead of simply adding together. And the example that she had in mind, mostly these are legal examples, but they certainly carry over more broadly, was, for example, in a class action lawsuit where a Black man who works in a factory is alleging that the Black employees are being treated unfairly on the basis of their race. A Black woman would generally not be thought of as a good representative of that class because, after all, some of what she's experiencing might be because she's a woman. By contrast, people in another employment environment or educational environment, women might claim that they were being discriminated against on the basis of their gender, right? That women were being treated worse, the girls or the women were being treated worse. A Black woman there too would generally not be seen as a good representative of that group because people would say, well, but maybe it's because she's a Black woman, right? Not because she's a woman, right? The idea that somehow the experience of a Black woman was somehow just being a Black person plus being a woman did not capture it for her, right? And the idea she came up with is that that Black women in particular experienced an intersectional form of discrimination. That is, their identity stood at the intersection of anti-Blackness and sexism in a unique way that's not just there's this plus this plus this plus this, right? And what that has become in the decades that have followed, this theory of intersectionality, is an approach to lots of different kinds of problems, including legal scenarios, where we're forced to notice what are the other identity categories that are invisible, right? Is it that you're a person or you're a woman? Right? You're white or you have a race, right? That is, it has helped people to articulate more fully that it isn't just women who have a gender. It isn't just Black people who have a race, right? It isn't just disabled people who stand in a relationship of physical ability or inability to the built environment, that all of us occupy in all of our different identities, some more and some less privileged statuses, and that these fit together to understand what our experience is, right? That we experience them in an integrated way, that the law needs to reflect that social policies need to reflect that what it means to be a Black woman in America and is different than what it means to be a Black man plus what it means to be a white woman. That's not the right way to think about it.
all right, let me just add on to what Diana just said. For those that have been following our health ministry, we've put some things in our mental health section about Black women and pregnancy and how the in the medical structure, how they deal with that. So I think that is an example that we could roll and look at that. Please go and do some more research. If you have not done that, Kimberly Crenshaw, so the intersectionality and everything, it's great. And we have a lot of let's be honest, in the National Baptist, most of our folks are what? Black women. So I want to look at that. Okay. Well, that brings me to another thing that you're helping me to look at. This whole idea about race. I watched the videos, Dr. King and assassination. Even Richard Nixon came in with the Office of Economic Opportunity, and we really thought we had made it. Ebony and Jet was showing us all these wonderful things in America, and we thought that race was over. So why do you think, really, I hate to say it, but it seems like we're entering another round of the civil rights movement, or maybe just a continuation? It's thought about it, but some people see it as a a new civil rights movement coming up, and another crisis, and other people see it as a continuation of it because it has never stopped since 1619. So how would you characterize that? Is it something new, or is it a continuation, or is it something third that we haven't come up with? It. Go ahead.
Well, it's complicated. And of course, this is, I regard this as one of the most complicated questions that we face in America. And I, as a law student, as a lawyer, and as a legal scholar, part of the reason why I think of myself as an endorser and participant in critical race theory is that I think it is among the most fruitful ways of thinking about how white supremacy actually operates. Right? Okay. That white supremacy operates through law, but it does not restrict itself to law. And so when we think about, for example, the civil rights amendments, right, as the way the Constitution was changed in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, right, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which abolished slavery, which put in place at least the initial pieces of voting rights, keeping in mind that no woman of any race was voting at that time. But the civil rights amendments in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War were absolutely necessary. The United States Constitution had to be amended because the United States Constitution had been drafted in such a way as to tolerate and politically endorse and favor slavery. So that had to be undone, right? Any claim that our Constitution is colorblind or ever was is naive. An instrument, a document, a structure need not mention race explicitly in order to have predictable and intended consequences that are racialized. And the United States Constitution did. And in fact, the current structure of the U.S. Senate reflects the continuing persistence of this. I could say more about it if I needed to. So the idea that changing the Constitution would change every structure in American life that had been premised on race inequality, including of the most extreme kind, enslavement, but many other kinds also, that could be wiped out with the stroke of a pen, right? Few people probably believed that. That's why there were Union troops in the South through the beginning of Reconstruction. Everybody knew that those words on paper were not going to be self-executing, right? They don't have magical powers. They're just words on paper. And the ultimate collapse of Reconstruction and the withdrawal of Union troops led to the consequences with which all of us are only too familiar, right? The failure of Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and lynching. Right? Those are basically the consequences of the withdrawal of an armed attempt at Reconstruction on the part of the Union, the anti-slavery forces of the Union. And as many of you are probably aware, in the years immediately following the Civil War, in many states that had formerly been slave states, immediately after the Civil War, the Black population outnumbered the white population. That was often true even in the antebellum period, but the Civil War was incredibly destructive to the white male population of the Confederacy. And so places where the numbers had been more even, many more formerly enslaved Black men survived the Civil War, right? And so in many of those places, once those men could vote, they elected Black representatives all across the South, the first Black U.S. senators and U.S. congressmen and so on, right? That is, Black people, despite their experiences in the United States, stood ready to fully participate in the institutions of American democracy. And this is actually part of the argument made by Nicole Hannah-Jones in the 1619 Project. In some ways, one of her most radical claims, and one that has produced much of the pushback from the right, which is her view that it is Black people and not white people who actually believed what the Constitution said and were determined to make it come true, despite everything, right? And in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, we saw that. And we saw the reaction to it, right? That is, the people whose entire lives, economic and otherwise, had been built upon the enslavement of Africans and persons of African descent, did not go quietly, right? Even when they lost. They fought back, and they were on their home turf. Right? And the Union was not going to occupy the South forever, right? With the predictable consequences that then give rise to both the Great Migration, right, and the rearrangement of the American population with large Black urban centers in places that had had very few Africans or persons of African descent in the antebellum period, the great cities of the Midwest, as well as Black communities on the West Coast, and so on, which really remade America. Like 20th century America, from my point of view, was remade every bit as much by the Great Migration as by any other single event or large-scale occurrence. But that was compatible with continuing legal subordination and segregation of Black people, as we know, right, in the first half of the 20th century. And it is to that that the civil rights movement was, in large part, a response. And that, too, faced a reaction and retrenchment, right, beginning in the Reagan years and following. Right. And that's where we are now, right, at a period which some people are actually calling, right, a second Reconstruction, or the right, that is, we are now in a period where the same large scale changes are needed, God willing, with dramatically less bloodshed, but no less dramatic in the need to remake the country, right? Because what we have done so far, be it the civil rights amendments or the civil rights movement, has not created substantive equality of opportunity for people regardless of race. It has not kept that promise to its citizens. It has not. That is an empirical fact. And then we find ourselves in a conversation about what are the limits and the potencies of law to do that. And that, again, is an area about which people disagree, right? Some people think that the laws have failed, we need more and better laws. Other people think the laws have failed, that shows that law fails, and we need to do this a different way. People of good conscience can differ on that question, I think.
Wow, you just shook me to my core when you said that, but you're so right. We're in the midst of a second Reconstruction. Wow. Wow. I just want everybody that's listening, that's on, and I thank you. I mean, I'm just blown away by the number of people watching on social media. Sometimes social media kind of fluctuate, but people are holding tight. Look, let me do my ID break. Again, my name is Michael Miner. I am the National Director of the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated Hope Health Ministry, and I am hosting today the last in our series of a webinar series for the National Baptist Congress. We're having a conversation, the 1619 Project, Critical Race Theory. We're glad to have as our guest today, Diane Klein, who is a noted expert in this area. And of course, best of all, she's part of my class of 1987 at Harvard. All right, but look, everybody, she said that we are in the midst of a second Reconstruction. Y'all roll that out. Y'all take that and roll it. And also for those that are doing Christian education, I think it's an opportunity for you to discuss, have in some of your sessions, especially with our younger people, about the Great Migration. The Great Migration, that's a great discussion. You said some things here. I want to talk about it. Maybe I got it wrong. You correct me. Talking about this whole idea, and I don't know if they're different, this whole idea about white privilege, white supremacy. I don't know if they are the same, different, whatnot. They kept coming up. So can you just kind of shed some light on this whole idea of white supremacy, white privilege?
Sure. So thinking about white privilege as a thing, right, is another feature of feminist and race theory coming out of the 1970s and 1980s. And one of the first people who had a lot of influence in thinking about white privilege early on was a scholar, a white woman named Peggy McIntosh, who wrote an article called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. Knapsack is like such an antique word already. But the idea, right, of this piece was that she put together a long list of things, privileges, we might say, that she enjoyed as a white woman that she found it very easy to forget about, right? So she wasn't talking about, right, overt systems of discrimination, right? She was talking about all of the things that are easier in your life in America if you are a white person. Now, part of what's striking about the approach that she took, and I think what partly accounts for its influence, is I don't think many Black people in America would have had a hard time coming up with a list of 20 or 30 things that are easier if you're white in America, right? I think any group of Black people sitting at a dinner table could have come up with a list, right, just as inclusive, just as provocative as hers. But what she took on herself, and certainly influenced me and many, many other people, was the idea that white people needed to talk to white people about this. White people needed to point out to white people all of the things that Black people had to deal with that white people didn't, that were invisible. And an example of that, of course, that's come into the national consciousness a little bit more, is what is sometimes referred to as the talk, right? Having to talk to your Black children about encounters that they might have with law enforcement. And that's just a thing that does not happen in white families. It just doesn't. Because why would it? Right? All you would tell your kids when they're learning to drive is if you're pulled over, you know, if you hear the lights, pull over and be polite, I suppose you might say, right? That is, you wouldn't say more than that because you wouldn't think that you needed to, right? You wouldn't be measuring the effect, right, of the risks that were associated with that. And that, of course, is a very grave example. And she really, her examples ran the gamut, and intentionally so, right? That is, they ran the gamut from not having to have the talk or not worrying that you would be a victim of violence in an interaction with law enforcement to Band-Aids will match your skin, right?
Oh,
Right? There will be a crayon in the box that's your color of skin. It will be easy to find makeup that matches your skin. When you watch television, you'll see people who are your race. And of course, many of these things have changed, right? This publication was in the 70s when you wouldn't see an interracial couple in a television commercial.
No.
You just wouldn't see it. Now you do. Every bank and, you know, car dealer, right? You're seeing mixed race families. So it is not to say, and no one, not anyone in critical race theory or anywhere else, is saying that no feature of American life has changed since the 1860s or the 1960s. We all know there are all kinds of ways in which it has changed, but it's not enough, right? We're not there yet. And when we look at large scale macro data, right, we see persistent inequality, right? That is, we can look at Oprah, we can look at Michael Jordan, but when we look at large scale data about wealth inequality, what we see is that the household wealth of white high school graduates is the same as that of Black college graduates. And so part of what follows from that is that easy prescriptions that say to Black people, go educate yourself. Look how much better college graduates do than high school graduates. Well, that's not quite the reality for complex reasons. And often those are reasons that have to do with the history of housing, with availability of credit, with the likelihood of inheriting money from somebody in your family, what happens in the event of a financial reversal, whether people participate in retirement savings programs available through their job, just a whole host, the way the tax system works, a whole host of things that operate to make it more difficult for people of color, and especially Black people in America, to get ahead, no matter what they do. And yes, I see from a panelist, Dorothy Brown, critical race theory tax professor at Emory, has just published a book just this year called The Whiteness of Wealth, and she has been appearing here and there on TV. So again, she's a TV star now, right? She was a tax law professor who never thought, right, she would be famous. And basically her entire career has been devoted to showing the ways in which apparently race-neutral laws, especially tax laws, systematically disadvantage some people and advantage other people. In other words, the tax law can contribute to systemic racism without ever mentioning race, which it never does. By the way, you read the Internal Revenue Code, right? There's never a mention of it. So to come back to white privilege and white supremacy, the first thing that I would say is that, though it's maybe not quite so much true now as it was when this first began to be articulated, it's easier to talk to many people about white privilege and to try to introduce them, that is white people, talking to white people about the ways in which being white is beneficial in America. right? That is not such a hard conversation to have, whatever it might motivate about changes in law and changes in policy and so on, right? Most people can be brought to respond not so very defensively, I might say, to the idea that they enjoy certain unearned privileges. Everyone enjoys some unearned privileges. Being good looking is an unearned privilege, right? That's it. What are we going to say, right? Nobody deserves, pick different parents. I don't know what to tell you, right? Everyone
Graduate from
enjoys,
Harvard.
yeah, everyone enjoys some elements of unearned privilege.
Right.
A way that people sometimes talk about this, in not necessarily in the scholarly environment, is that what white privilege means is not that everything in your life is going to go great. It's that your race will not be the reason it doesn't. Right? It's not that everything's going to go great. There are poor white people, sick white people, etc. Right? But their race is not an obstacle in addition to all the other obstacles that they may have to face. And that's kind of the essence, right, of what white privilege is all about in its many manifestations. White supremacy is perhaps a more contentious way to put it, right? That is, it's a deliberately more provocative way, perhaps, to characterize large-scale structures of white privilege, because what they result in and what they perpetuate is white supremacy. Right? The idea that not just people come in different races, but that there's a best race to be, and that race is white, right? And that is hidden inside of many, even well-meaning attempts to ameliorate racism, at least among white people, right? There is a lot of white supremacy in well-meaning white liberalism about race, right? That is a lot of, for example, the idea that if the way that you understand affirmative action, for example, is that Black people need extra help, that is a form of white supremacy, right? If you understand affirmative action as an appropriate intervention to systemic racism and discrimination, that is not white supremacy, right? And so the way that we think about and talk about and understand even things that we can share the judgment that they are a wrong, or as the case may be, that they may be a helpful intervention. There are ways of doing that that perpetuate white supremacy, and there are ways of doing it that dismantle it. And that's really, I mean, I take it this is where we're going next, and it's the quote that's on my Teachers Pay Teachers page from Ibram Kendi, whose book is called How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Yes.
And,
so that's the question.
Yeah. Okay.
So thing is, so now people says I am, and look, I have friends come to me and say, Michael, I'm not racist. You know me. I may be white, but
they don't care if you're purple. Do they throw that in? Yeah.
Right. So help us understand this whole idea between anti-racist and non-racist.
Okay. So the quote that I was going to allude to that's on my Teachers Pay Teachers page from Ibram X. Kendi's book is the opposite of racist is not non-racist. It is anti-racist. Right. And the idea is
catch that. Repeat that again, Dan. Make sure you caught that now.
The opposite of racist is not non-racist. It is anti-racist.
All right, there you go.
And so let me unpack that a little bit. And that statement is intended to reflect the idea, which is absolutely a critical race theory idea, that the way we need to think about racism is not as a personal vice, a psychological disorder in an individual, right? It's not, the problem of racism is not that there are a bunch of individual racists out there running around doing racist stuff. Okay, it's not to deny that there are such people. Of course there are such people, right? Of course there are race bigots. But that the problem of racial inequality in the United States is not about finding and curing one at a time those individual racists. That racism is structural and systemic. It is built into policing or education or the way that money is loaned, the way that housing is developed, how we figure out where the freeways go, right? That it is, and so in order to resist and dismantle that, we have to be against it, right? We actually have to dismantle it, not just say, oh, that has nothing to do with me because I am not a race bigot. I don't see race, say people untruthfully, because everyone sees race, right? But that the idea that you can remove yourself, and this is also related to what we might call a narrative of white innocence, right? I never owned a slave. In fact, no one to whom I'm related ever owned or purported to own a slave. How can it have anything to do with me? Right? The answer to that is, number one, you continue to benefit from unearned race privilege, right? Unearned white privilege. You also operate as a white person inside of white supremacy. And if you are not dismantling that, you are perpetuating it, right? There is no neutrality because the system operates to subordinate. And so if you're not undoing it, you're doing it. That's it. If you're not undoing it, you're doing it, right? You're not standing on the sidelines. And that is, it certainly is true for me personally, right? The people from whom I'm descended, there is not one person from whom I'm directly descended who was even in the United States before the 1870s, right? I have 3 of 4 Jewish grandparents. The other is a Mormon and the child of a British Mormon who came over in the 1870s. The rest all came after 1900. Right? And like many American Jews of similar descent, it is all too tempting to say slavery, right? While that was happening in the United States, my ancestors were being victimized by pogroms in Russia. Don't come crying to me, right? This is to misunderstand profoundly the structure of white supremacy in America, and that the ability of Europeans, including European Jews, to enter into American whiteness and enjoy its benefits is the thing that with which we must reckon, not our personal or familial responsibility. That's not what it's all about. It's about these large-scale structures.
All right, and look, we want to give a warning out to everybody that we're probably going to run over our normal hour time. Diana said that she's willing to go over and we're going to field some questions. We're going to probably go a little bit over on our social media time, and then we'll go out as we normally do with our Zoom audience separately and answer some more questions. All right, so the thing I'm getting, it's like, oh, it's a fire, it's a warning, oh, it's critical race theory, is it not clear? Now, I'm just trying to figure this out. I'm just under the idea that critical race theory has not, N-O-T, not been actively taught in high school. But now, just correct me if I'm wrong. Has critical race theory been an active part of the curriculum in American high schools?
Absolutely not. So let me say a few things about that, because part of me wants to say it's not being taught in American high schools, much less in primary school. And that's very unfortunate, because I kind of wish it were, right? So it's a whole different thing, right? Critical race theory is complicated. Those of us who teach it in law school, right, have a hard time teaching it. It's complicated, right? It's quite complicated and sophisticated. And so the idea that it's being taught in any sense explicitly, truly, is ridiculous. Now, what is not right? Now, what is not ridiculous, right? And so this is the part of that critique with which we want to be honest, is, are there ways of approaching the history of race in America, even as it is taught in elementary, middle, and high school, that are influenced by critical race theory? Without a doubt. That is absolutely correct. And I would hope that it is true. And I am laboring mightily to make it true in the materials that I myself have created, which are in use in classrooms across the country. And each and every one of them, whether they're in Black history, American history, in English language arts, I teach the poetry of Maya Angelou, of Langston Hughes, right, of Amanda Gorman, who spoke at the inauguration. There is no question that every line of what I write, right, is influenced by a critical race theory perspective, right, okay, which is intended to convey how race inequality and the legacy of slavery continue to make themselves felt in America, right? So in that way, is critical race theory influencing the way students are being taught? I certainly hope so. That's what we've all been trying to do. But is critical race theory itself being taught? Absolutely not. You can barely get it on the curriculum in a law school.
All right, everybody. So I just want to lay this out to all our Christian educators who are watching in that Christian Education Week. The truth of the matter is that all the people out here that's saying that it's being taught is that it's not, but actually because they're saying that they want us not to teach it, is now on the cusp of being taught very much in our churches and our families and everything else. So then why is that there's this, why are they passing the laws? I guess there's two things here. It's the misconception they're having about it, twisting around of it, then they're passing the law. So what is it? So why is it a problem? You know, why is it a problem? It seems like there's a law in search of a problem out here. So help me with this thing.
Well, I think there are many misconceptions about how curriculum is set in public schools in the United States. Most people don't know much about it unless they observe it up close. And the truth is, I didn't know much about it until my fiance decided to do a midlife career change and earn a teaching credential in California. He's a teacher in the LAUSD in South Central LA. And so there we were, right, reading through books of curriculum because your lesson plans have to coordinate with the curriculum prescribed both by the state and the school district and so on. So the process of creating curriculum is a heavily bureaucratic one, and it involves textbook publishers, and it involves school boards at the state and the local level, and so on. It is absolutely correct to say that the teaching of American history is itself among the most controversial of areas. That is, what you teach and what you don't teach, what you test students on and what you don't test students on, what counts as the right answer, right? To take kind of the most classic, and it's, you know, an ongoing conversation, certainly among people our age, that is people who are in their 50s. But along with people who are both younger and older, which is, what are students taught is the reason for the Civil War? In an American history class, what are students taught is the reason for the Civil War. And what many people don't know, who are now all up in arms about a critical race theory approach to the teaching of the Civil War, is that what is in many American textbooks was the product of reactionary, right-wing, well-organized forces descended often directly from people who had fought for the Confederacy to invent the idea that the Civil War was fought over states' rights. And not just that idea, but to get that idea into the history books used by students in 4th grade, in 5th grade, in 8th grade, whenever it is that U.S. history is taught. So the idea that before critical race theory, primary American history books were revealed on Mount Sinai and handed down? No, these books were always written by people to advance an idea, right? Always, right? Whether they're written in the 1920s, the 1950s, now, it's always to advance and further ideas about what sort of place America is, how it came to be the place that it is. And what's really come to the surface now is the political contestation around that. And the forces are arrayed. I mean, there are lots of people in America who I guess wouldn't want American school children to know that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were slave owners, which they were. Among the many things that they were that, right? And what follows from that, right? And the idea that the United States is only a country towards which we can feel patriotism if we believe a bunch of things about it that are false is absolutely belied by the experience of African-American patriots in every American war, in every decade of our country's history, who have fought and died because they believed in those ideas, right? And they were not naive, right? But neither were they cynical. And we should be inspired by that, right? That is, nothing but the truth will set us free. Will even the truth set us free? Who knows? Who knows? But nothing but the truth will set us free for sure.
And I got to throw this in, and I had to raise both my hands on this. I thought I was a person that did quite a bit about history, especially when it comes to the history of race. And I didn't realize that Stone Mountain, of all the 3 Confederate, it really wasn't completed until the 70s. It was not something. I just had the thing when Dr. King was having his speech, I thought it was talking about that, but it's something new. But what ends up happening, people make you think it's been there all the time. It's part of history, but it's something new. So again, can I beg again? I'm begging all our Christian educators to take an opportunity to revisit all this stuff in your Sunday school classes and whatnot and everything that we have. Can I be bold here, Diane? You're working on some things here and get some things in place. Why don't you and your fiance work on something so we can have it as another little guidebook? I know you're doing a little study guide for us. We do a pilot and stuff. So you and your fiance, look, y'all here first right here on June 24th, 2021, that you come up with something that we can have and we can go in, which brings me to this next question is, now, Diane, I'm looking at you and I think most people will realize you're not Black. Matter of fact, you are white. And not only are you white, you're in LA and you went to all these great schools and things like this. So how could this white woman from LA get involved with this whole thing about race? And I would say been very articulate, because usually we have these webinars by this time of an hour, we're maybe down to about 10 people. And then on the social media, we're probably not anybody, and we're still going strong. So help us to understand your journey.
Sure. Well, I appreciate your asking. So I've been interested in the subject generally for most of my life. I was the child of white Jewish liberals, well-meaning white liberals is kind of the way that I think about it. And both my father was born in 1940, my mother was born in 1941. They both grew up in Southern California and understood themselves to be, let's say, integrationists, right? That certainly is where their politics were. My maternal grandmother was the principal of a school in the LAUSD and supported the integration of schools. My mother attended a more or less integrated high school, Dorsey High School in Los Angeles, regarded that as a valuable experience, right? So I would certainly say of my parents that they were not racists, right? I don't know that I would say they were anti-racist, right? But they were not racist, right? So I did not grow up in a racist household, I think. I certainly could say that. And I also grew up in a household, like many left-leaning Jewish people, who saw themselves as supporters of civil rights and saw Jews and Black people as aligned, right, in the fight for civil rights and greater participation in American life. And there's a lot to say about the relationship between Blacks and Jews in America, including unfortunate episodes of Jewish racism and Black anti-Semitism, but also tremendously inspiring examples of coordination and cooperation, Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King Jr., right, and so on. And I certainly grew up being inspired by that. And thinking that part of my Jewish identity was caught up in seeking equality for all people, right? That the significance of coming to the United States and having greater opportunity as a Jewish person was not, we got ours and everybody else can take care of themselves, but rather, right, that there was a joint project. And even beyond that, to speak in sort of more explicitly religious terms, although I did not grow up in a very observant household, Jews who are even minimally observant, right, who observe Passover, who go to a Passover Seder once a year and read from the Haggadah, take in, right, from very early in life, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, right, and that slavery is wrong, that delivery from enslavement is essential to reflect the divinity that is in every person, right, and so I certainly felt that always just as a Jew, again, even not as an especially observant person. Once I was in law school and had a sense that I would probably be a law professor, I had the tremendous benefit of being taught by Black law professors, of whom there were not very many at that time. And those who taught me were very eminent. I was in law school, law school class of 97. I was at the UCLA Law School when Prop 209 was passed, which I certainly don't expect people outside of California to know about in detail. but it was a statewide proposition that made affirmative action in higher education, as race-conscious affirmative action in higher education, illegal in California. And so I knew, even as I was studying there in 1996, one of the courses that I took with Kim Crenshaw was a seminar on critical race theory and intersectionality. And I sat there in a class, a majority of whose members, or a majority of the students in the class, were Black women, thinking, this is probably the last class, a majority of whose members will be Black women, that will ever be taught in this institution.
Wow.
And I'm right about that, right? UCLA's graduates about 325 students a year. And at the time that I was there were, across the 3 years, 80 or 100 Black students. In the years that followed, entering classes had 5 Black students in them,
Wow.
10. I mean, it was like the pre-civil rights era, right? A handful of extraordinary individuals, right, were able to somehow make it work. And so, because these were issues in which I had an interest, when I became a law professor, my first job was at an HBCU. That was the job that, when it was offered to me, it was the one that I wanted to take. And I was also determined that my kids would see me put my body where my mouth was, right? They lived in California. I'd gone to school on the East Coast. And off we went to Texas, which I know it sort of is the South and it's sort of not the South, and those debates rage. But Houston, Texas, in an HBCU in the 9th Ward is definitely not LA or Boston, right? So it may not be the South, right? I'm not naive about that, but it was very different. And in the 3 years that I spent there, my first 3 years as a law professor, I taught more future Black lawyers than in the entire rest of my career combined. Because the percentage of Black law students is not significantly higher today than it was, if you can believe it, 100 years ago. It is not significantly higher. And the number of Black people in the profession is not significantly higher in percentage terms. The numbers are, of course, much greater, but not in percentage terms. Bar pass rates continue to be racially disparate. These problems are not going away. And it was important to me to be on the front lines of it. And I've been there ever since. I'm a property law professor. There's no way to learn and teach the law of property of the United States without talking about enslavement and its consequences. So I've been doing it ever since.
Wow. And I know we got the Harvard connection, all those schools. Is there anything? So is there any 2 or 3 other things about your professional background that we want to lift up? I mean, especially the fact that we have a lot of our national bachelor, a lot of women. Is there anything you can say from a feminist perspective that may be helpful as we breach this critical race theory thing and everything else around it?
Sure. And certainly to continue in thinking about intersectionality and its significance. This too is something where what I read, the scholarship that I was reading and the law reviews about it and the lived experience of my students came home to me very vividly. And again, from those first few years of teaching, lots of the experiences that I had there were very influential for me, including women. I had, for example, a student who I remember very vividly, who was a young mother when she was a law student. She was in her mid-20s, and she did well in law school, so she was interviewed by a variety of firms, and found that in every interview, right, in which she managed that, somehow she mentioned that she was a mother, there was no callback interview forthcoming, right? Even though she was a married woman, right? So this is partly the stereotype of what? She's a welfare queen, despite being a law student, right? And that for all those in which she did not mention it, she got the callback interview, and she ended up working, I don't know where exactly what the details were, but that's sort of a perfect example of the intersectional position in which she found herself. That is, the people who were interviewing her couldn't even see her through their stereotypes of what a young Black mother must be like, right? It didn't matter that she was a law student, right? It's so obscured was she by the weight of these stereotypes that she couldn't fight her way through, right? And that's just one example, right, in microcosm of the issues that have been faced. And again, it's not that there's no good news, right? And I wouldn't want to neglect to mention, partly because I want to take credit for a small piece of it, not for the big thing that I'm about to say. There are about 200 law schools in America. And this year, for the first time in history, there are 27 Black female law deans in just 200
Wow.
schools. It's the year of the Black female law dean, which again, I take absolutely no credit for that. What I take a little bit of credit for is that they're going to do a cover story in the HBCU Times, because many of them, to kind of bring it back to a point that you made, many of those women have a significant connection to at least one HBCU, as do many Black women who are prominent in our national life. Stacey Abrams, for example, who, you know, some people think has single-handedly done as much as any person has to save our democracy through her actions in Georgia, is a Yale Law School graduate, right? Yale is obviously a fancy Ivy League place and the most selective law school in the country, but she went to college at Spelman. And again, right, you see in the women who are in these leadership positions that connection to one HBCU or another. And of course, Kamala Harris, our vice president, who went to the Stanford Law School, but she went to Howard, right? That was a crucial and formative experience. And that certainly for Black, and of course, for many Black men as well. That the Morehouse man and all of that, there's lots to say about that as well. But for Black women in leadership, you know, scratch them, and they're a Alpha Kappa Alpha or whatever it might be from their HBCU experience. Those are hugely valuable. I mean, from my point of view, they ought to be completely underwritten by the federal government and the states in which they are located as a form of reparations. Everyone who attends them should be doing so tuition free, from my point of view. But regardless of that, I think that they are engines of opportunity for Black women, and are as deserving of our support as any institutions in American life could be.
All right, Cheryl, you heard it first here. Diane said that, look, if you want to put reparations in a good place, you're arguing instead of going to individual, just put the reparations in the HBCUs. There we go. All right, look, this is what we're going to do. We're getting ready for the question and answer section. Come on, get your questions and everything lined up. We're going to try to take as many as we can from social media, but we do want to give a few little updates from the National Baptist here. Okay. We're excited about this week for National Baptist Congress. Again, we want to recognize our president, Dr. Jerry Young, and the president of our Congress, Dr. Elliott Cuff. Reminding everybody, this is June, finishing up in June. This has been Men's Health Month, and July, and a Cataract Awareness Month. And July comes to July 4th. Now we have Juneteenth through July 4th, Fireworks Safety Month week. Well, I guess it's about a month now. Be careful about those fireworks. Don't hold them in your hands so some of your fingers end up missing. Don't do that. Summer of Health and Wellness Vacation Bible School. We know some of y'all are going back and getting involved. That now that the pandemic is easing up, get some exercise involved in it, even if you're doing it virtually. And of course, July is going to be National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. Catch us on the web, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, especially YouTube. We have some great content. I tell you, I know that Diane, your video is going to really go and be out there for us. The webinar, we wanted you to complete our survey to help us to be a little bit better in what we're doing. All right, folks, if you got questions, will you type those in the chat? All right, and we'll do this. Okay, all right, we're coming here from our social media. Somebody wants to know if somebody confronts them with this critical race theory, are there about 2 or 3 little talking points that they could just say about what it is as a counterpoint to what's out there now? I know that maybe it's kind of crazy, but hey, I'm just relaying what the question is.
Yeah, I think the best thing to say is that the proponents of critical race theory do not hate white people. They do not hate America. They're not trying to get anybody to hate white people or to hate America. That to understand the truth of our history allows us to honor and respect the contributions of everyone to it. Right, that's it. That's what we're trying to do, as well as to try to figure out what is necessary in order to create substantive equality. Right, that really is the goal. Again, critical race theory is not the only way to do it, but critical race theory is also not a bogeyman. And the suggestion that being aware of race in America makes you a racist is ridiculous and naive. It's hard to know how to dignify it more than that.
Okay. All right. The next question is, they said you stated that the way the Senate is set up and everything happening with the Senate is a vestige, I guess, of the slavery times. Kind of go into, expound upon that comment with you.
Sure. So I whether people are entirely familiar with exactly how our bicameral legislature, that is the House of Representatives as well as the Senate, were first selected, the idea that every state should be equally represented, for one thing, obviously derives from a time when no one imagined that there would be population discrepancies like we see today, right, between Wyoming on the one hand and California on the other, right? So the idea that Wyoming has 2 senators and so does California strikes many of us in California, right, as pretty ridiculous. But the real point from which some of these discrepancies derive is the notorious 3/5 compromise. Using the population of a state to determine its representation in Congress required a compromise about whether persons who were enslaved were to be counted for these purposes. If they were going to be counted as full individuals, then it would be at least possible for states to be taxed on that basis, even though they would also enjoy greater representation on that basis. And that's the origin of the so-called 3/5 compromise. But the idea and the way that states were divided created overrepresentation for states where persons were enslaved by comparison to their voters. Because as long as non-voting enslaved persons counted at all, there was going to be overrepresentation because those persons were not going to be participating in the selection of their representatives if they count at all. In addition, states were divided and thus multiplied their representation in the Senate in territories where there were people held in slavery and not elsewhere, right? So the division between North Carolina and South Carolina, for example, right? Carolina was just one place until it was 2 places, right? And then twice as many senators. South Carolina being a place that notoriously had an enslaved population that outnumbered its free population for many, many years. And so it has 2 senators elected by what was a minority of a minority, right? That is, white people were a minority and then men were a minority, or a bear, right? That is close to 50-50, electing 2 senators compared to places where the entire population, right, or the entire male population, right, was participating in the political process. So there are all kinds of ways, right, in which features of our politics are vestiges of that built-in inequality.
All right. It sounds a whole lot like, and next year, folks need to VOTE, VOTE, VOTE. All right. Look, I'm getting kind of a little messaging from my team that there are probably some more questions that people want to ask that are on Zoom, but they'd rather not have them broadcast on social media, which I understand that. I don't have a problem with that at all. And so we'll do that. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to wrap up the social media part. So don't run away, Diane. Let me do my little thing here for that, and we're gonna come right back and open up it for our Zoom call. Again, folks, it's been a great week. I do want to give a shout out to our team. Of course, Michael Miner, the National Director, Lottie Miner, she may be some relation to me. Pastor Bernard Montgomery, Bettina Campbell, Pastor Dexter Moraney, Ellen McKnight, Dr. Felisa Washington, Ms. Geraldine Moore, Dr. Desi Levy, Linda Copper, Loretta Miller, Dr. Lavora Williams, Michelle Johnson, our team from Hope. You can learn more about us at hopenbc.com. We hope that you would go in and also check out the website for our special guest today, Diane Klein. Go to dianejklein.com. That's Klein. Diane is Diane. Just go ahead and just Google her and you'll be finding a wealth of information. And we're looking forward to working with her on some activities that can help us in our Christian education work. Once again, we acknowledge the president of the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated, Dr. Jerry Young, who reminds us to envision the future exceptionally. This has been a production of the National Baptist Convention, USA Incorporated, the nation's largest Black denomination. God bless and God keep you is our prayer.